Next, we're going to hear from Martin Lee, who is well known for his website and history with Project CBD. I know that's one of the first resources I was able to find when I started my journey, and so I'm excited to have him present.
Thank you. Okay. We're waiting for the slides here. I'm going to talk about brain injuries, both stroke and TBI, traumatic brain injuries. And while they're caused by different things, stroke is an internal blockage, a hemorrhage. A TBI is a concussive force from external. But the actual injury and what happens is very, very similar, what goes on in the brain. So I'm going to talk about both of those. And Bonnie mentioned in her talk briefly when she was focusing on stroke, how there's contradictory results when they're looking at research. And one of the reasons is it's a very complex injury. Initially, that initial insult is caused by a sudden deprivation of oxygen. And yet the initial insult or injury is then triggers a secondary injury cascade that involves sort of an overwhelming onrush of oxygen, reperfusion. So what might be effective therapeutically initially could be just the opposite of what you need in the secondary part of it. So it's a very complex injury in that regard. And for me, it's very personal because I suffered a stroke, a massive stroke in 2006. You could see that white area of my brain that doesn't exist anymore. That's in the cerebellum. I lost about a third of my cerebellum. And cerebellum stroke is a bit unusual compared to what we usually think of strokes. In the cortex, you suffer language decrements and so forth. It's not the case with the cerebellum. You're more likely to die, but if you recover, if you endure it, your recovery, you don't suffer the same kind of deficits you ordinarily think of with a stroke. So this was in 2006. I'm not going to go into a story about what happened to me personally. Cannabis was very helpful. I want to talk more in general, what we know about cannabis and strokes and TBI. This is, and I'll share a few science papers. This is from 2014, and this is looking at the effect of marijuana use on people who have strokes. And basically what they found is that you're more likely to survive and have a better outcome if you're a marijuana user. So the quote from marijuana use is associated with decreased mortality in adult patients sustaining TBI. And what they refer to now is THC-rich cannabis. They were looking for, they would do a screening and who had what in that regard. So why is this the case? Well, to go back to a foundational science study published in 1998, which has been very significant, that it formed the basis of a patent that the US government claimed on the antioxidant neuroprotective effects of cannabinoids. This has been misrepresented by the CBD industry as a patent on CBD. This was a patent that the government took out, but based on cannabinoid research, both THC and CBD. So I should point out that this particular study was done by scientists associated by the National Institute of Health. There were 4 scientists who authored this paper, including a Nobel laureate. So this is a very important study, and as I mentioned, it formed the basis of this patent, which specifically mentioned that cannabinoids have applications as neuroprotection in limiting neurological damage following ischemic insults, such as stroke and trauma, and many other neurological diseases that it was considered helpful for. So when we talk about neuroprotection, there's other research that is subsequent to the patent. This one from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in London from 2016. And I colored it in red the gist of it. This is a scientific study looking at impact of cannabinoids on dementia as having an anti-dementia effect. And it says cannabinoids protect neurons on the molecular level. The progression of brain aging and the pathogenesis of neurogenetic diseases are suppressed by cannabinoids. This is not a controversial thing in science. This is understood to be the case. What's interesting is if you go back about 5,000 years, the ancient Chinese said the same thing. And the first medical text ever assembled by humankind, the first pharmacopoeia, when referring to cannabis, which was described as one of the supreme elixirs of immortality, said to confer longevity, you see from the medical text, protracted taking may make one fat, strong, and never senile. That's the key part. So somehow they knew back then what we're just figuring out today, and with all our modern science. Okay, so the question is, so why is this? Or how does this happen? What's the gist? And as Bonnie and others have pointed out, essentially what the cannabinoids do, the plant cannabinoids, they augment and mimic the effects of the endogenous compounds, the endogenous cannabinoids. And the endogenous compounds are part of the endocannabinoid system. So looking specifically at stroke, what I wanted to do is look at various aspects of what's referred to as that secondary injury cascade in a stroke or TBI. And you have various processes that unfold that are aberrant as a result of the brain injury. And each of these processes, it turns out, are regulated by the endocannabinoid system. And if cannabinoids are included or added, it can mitigate the damage. So we have, for example, with the stroke or TBI, always a glutamate overload, excitotoxicity. Well, the endocannabinoid system turns down the glutamate transmission. You have inflammation, of course, we know, anti-inflammatory effect of CBD and THC. Reactive oxygen species, that refers to that first foundational document about the antioxidant effects of cannabinoids. The next one, blood-brain barrier dysregulation. What the endocannabinoid system is supposed to do, if it was operating normally, would be to restore the integrity of the brain-blood barrier. Then you have microvascular damage. You have damage to capillaries, to veins and artery in the brain. And the endocannabinoid system, it regulates vasodilation, the integrity of the blood vessels themselves. Ion imbalance, we can go into that, but it has to do with mitochondria function, sort of the whole, the balance in terms of calcium influx, so it just goes crazy when you have a brain injury like that. So next, but brain tissue swelling, edema, obviously, inflammation. What's so dangerous about a cerebellum stroke is when it swells, it can hit the brain stem and then you die. And I was literally minutes away from that. And emergency brain surgery saved my life. What cannabinoids do, it limits the size of the actual damage. It limits the infarct size. And this has been shown in many different experiments on animals. That if you give the animal the CBD, or it could be the THC, but the emphasis has been looking at CBD lately, either just before you inflict the brain damage or just after, it dramatically limits the size of the infarct. And finally, cell survival, cell death. The endocannabinoid system regulates apoptosis, the necessary either repair of brain cells, or if they have to commit suicide. They have to, that's all part of the maintenance of homeostasis. When we think of homeostasis, it makes it sound like, well, it's sort of a placid thing. It's just all still. Actually, homeostasis is an extremely dynamic process. We are continually repairing brain cells, destroying brain cells, and generating new brain cells. Adult mammals all generate new brain cells. It's called neurogenesis in certain parts of the brain. If that's not happening well, it's associated with clinical depression. Anyway, let's see. And just a couple of examples of research done on animal models with CBD in particular that points at some of these aspects of that refers to some of the aspects of the secondary brain injury. And this is a study showing CBD protects blood-brain barrier via the serotonin receptors and a nuclear receptor called the PPAR gamma. It works through those channels to do exactly what needs to happen when you're dealing with a secondary injury cascade in a stroke or a TBI. And for all those examples we were looking at in the previous slide, every one of them, CBD has a restorative function. Just one other example, we have I'll actually read the title of the abstract from the British Journal of Pharmacology. Acute administration of CBD in vivo, meaning a live animal, suppresses ischemia-induced cardiac arrhythmias and reduces infarct size when given at reperfusion. Meaning you have a stroke or TBI, your heart is going crazy. It's all out of whack. And in animal studies, CBD suppresses this and restores a natural heart rhythm. When given the reperfusion is that rush of oxygen that happens as part of that secondary injury cascade, which could be as damaging, if not more so, than the actual initial injury. I could have cited many other examples. I only have a few minutes, so I trust that you can look it up and research more if you want to in this area. But one thing I do want to emphasize, that we shouldn't forget about that initial slide about how stroke victims do better if they're cannabis users. And we shouldn't think of just in terms of CBD as the magic molecule for stroke, although if you have to pick one, I'd probably choose that one. But we shouldn't think just in terms of isolates. It's important, as other people have mentioned, the whole plant. We refer at Project CBD to CBD and THC as the power couple of cannabis therapeutics. Not just those two are the only ones that are important. It's the whole thing. But we think it's important to remind people in this era of CBD fad that we're going through now, and the whole. What can I say? I wasn't invited to Kim Kardashian's baby-themed CBD party that she had. Which I felt slighted since we've done so much to bring CBD to people's attention. Anyway, so CBD and THC, important to remember that they work synergistically, and they work better in combination than as isolates. I think that's the the last slide I want to emphasize is that when you're dealing with such a complex injury as a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, you need multifunctional drugs, drugs that don't do just one thing. You need a drug that addresses the whole list of those things that we had on the screen earlier. CBD and THC are both multifunctional compounds. And they should be considered first-line treatments for things like stroke and TBI, not the last thing after you've gone through everything and you're even more messed up than before. CBD-rich cannabis may be more efficacious for stroke and TBI than single-molecule CBD. And I acknowledge Cannacraft, which supports some of our work. I also want to give a shout-out to Fiddler's Green, who's been a steady supporter of Project CBD. More information, Smoke Signals, my book, and projectcbd.org, the website. We have a lot of information up there about neurological diseases. And finally, we always invite people up to Emerald Farms if you want to enjoy a beautiful afternoon in Hopland. Thank you.